Hi, it's Chris Lee again. We are ready to talk about another aspect of sudden oak death. Do any of you who are watching this video have problems related to sudden oak death with your trees on your property? If so, maybe this could give you some ideas or at least some sources to turn to for further discussion on what approach you want to take to deal with sudden oak death on your property. I do want to mention before I start the talk that the pictures, the slides, and the concepts here come from a variety of folks, not just me, including other presenters on other aspects of oak health in this series, including Jana Valkovic and Ted Swicki. And so I want to acknowledge their contributions to these ideas and concepts. So let's talk about some of the possible things people have tried for managing sudden oak death. In general, here is part of the toolbox that we have thought about in the past and in the present for potentially managing the disease. When trees are infected with sudden oak death, they're either carriers of the pathogen or they're going to be infected and die from the pathogen. And so we need to think about that aspect when we're figuring out how to manage it out in the forest. One way to do it is to take away carrier trees and infected trees that could pass it on. And these are primarily bay laurel and tan oaks because both of them can carry the pathogen, and in addition, tan oak can be killed. You can remove trees or seedlings or saplings either with chainsaws, using chemicals, potentially with fire, or maybe removing the tissues of the tree that help keep it alive by girdling it. But then after you remove infected or carrier trees, you also have to think about what you're going to do with your site in the future. So we have to think about what kinds of things are going to be placed on the site. In other words, what are you going to plant there? Is it going to be resistant to this pathogen? How can you promote regeneration of new trees from the trees that are still on the site? So that's something you have to think about. Another potential avenue for managing the pathogen could be by preventing the pathogen from causing an infection in the first place, or potentially if there's a small infection, keeping that infection from getting worse. And that's where you see the agrifos down there in the list. And I'll explain what agrifos is in a bit. And then there may be other creative approaches that you will think of or that other people will be thinking of and developing in the future that we haven't got to yet. And so we'll touch on all of these in these short talks. I wanted to talk about first what's going on in Oregon, because Oregon has a very active program of management of this pathogen in its wildland areas. I'm kind of going generally from north to south, from Oregon down south through California, as I talk about these management approaches, because they've differed a little bit depending on geography. In Oregon, what they do is they remove the infected tan oak trees as well as rhododendrons, huckleberries, and sometimes bay laurels. They don't see bay laurel as a carrier of the pathogen to the same degree that we see it in California. And so they primarily focus their efforts on infected tan oaks. They kill trees in advance of the pathogen as well as infected trees. So they kill infected trees and the trees that are probably infected but that you can't see the infection on yet, to a certain buffer distance around those. And then they burn those trees that they've removed. They leave the Douglas firs, the redwoods, the other conifers that may be growing on the site, and the other hardwoods that are not hosts for the pathogen. And they sometimes plant new hosts after they have burned those ones that they've cut. And they've done this over a very vast acreage in Oregon. And while they haven't eradicated the pathogen from Oregon, they have slowed the spread. This is a result slide from Oregon showing that in the majority of their plots, when they go back and look for the pathogen in the soil and in the vegetation in the plots, they have tended to not find it. And so It's been very effective in most places, but again, this kind of treatment, which is in some ways analogous to a sort of cancer treatment, where you're trying to remove the active pathogen or the active site of disease, but you're also having to go outside of that a little bit to get what you can't see very easily. This sort of treatment, for the most part, works, but not 100%. And so they have to keep putting a lot of money and effort into these treatments every year to stay on top of it. Here is a set of pictures from Northern California. This is where we did some experimental treatments in Humboldt County that sort of resembled in some ways these Oregon treatments. But the purpose of really showing you these pictures is to show you that when you do these kinds of treatments where you remove tan oaks and bay laurels, you're not removing a whole forest. As a matter of fact, in many places and in many times, you're improving the look of your forest and you're improving conditions for the trees that you're leaving behind. It's often difficult for landowners to approach the idea of actively managing the vegetation in their woods because it seems like a drastic thing to do sometimes, to touch a tree, to take a tree down, to create space for other trees. But in many cases, this is exactly what used to happen and what hasn't been happening for a while, and it can actually improve the condition of the forest. So managing for Phytophthora ramorum by removing the hosts and the infected trees can often go hand in hand with other management goals that you have to improve the forest look and to improve the forest condition in general. And here's a schematic of one of those sorts of plots that I showed you in the last slide that once again reinforces the point that if you have a fairly dense stand, this could actually encourage the movement of the pathogen and the faster infection of those trees. And if you separate the trees out a little bit by removing those hosts and infected trees and getting a little bit less density in the forest, you can often improve conditions for the growth of the trees that remain behind. You can improve your disease situation, but you can also continue or improve the aesthetic look of the forest. So you're not clear cutting, you're not taking out all the trees, you're just dealing with disease. Here are some other operational pictures of some of the things that we've done in order to try to manage the pathogen in Northern California. In this site, we were removing bay laurels and we were removing tan oaks. And in many of these places, the forest condition was quite dense. We were taking these trees out and then we had to figure out what we wanted to do with all that material. It couldn't all just be piled and burned all around the forest where we were taking it out. And so we had to figure out different means of disposing of the material. And so some of it we actually loaded up in bins in these large containers, and we moved them to a biomass facility to produce electricity. So that's one possible option. And then here are some other pictures of work in that same area showing that depending on what your situation is, the work might be more or less difficult, involved, or costly. This was around a house, and so it was delicate work to remove the hosts. Here are some more before and after. I'm just going to take you through a series of pictures of before and after to show you that in many cases, the look of the property and the accessibility of the property through the trees was actually improved by removing bay laurels and tan oaks. The arrows refer to the same trees, and so in some of these cases it may look like the vantage point of the picture has been moved. So from the work that we've done in Northern California with some of these sorts of treatments, and in some of them we tried different things, such as removing bays only and leaving tan oaks, or following up the bay and tan oak removal with a prescribed burn to see what that did in terms of pathogen effectiveness. And here are some of the things we found from that work in Northern California. Obviously, when you remove tan oaks and bay laurels, they're going to resprout. They're going to produce a lot of resprouts. And if those sprouts aren't controlled, you may see sudden oak death. You may see that pathogen reinvading the spot and reinfecting those sprouts after some period of time. One round of prescribed burn did not necessarily help to remove Phytophthora ramorum. We unfortunately haven't been able to experiment at any site with multiple rounds of prescribed burning, so we don't know what those long-term effects will be. Bay removal alone tended to not be as effective as it could be because it's very difficult in a large forest area to make sure that you remove all of the bays. And that's what happened in some of our experiments, is that if bay laurels were left behind, they served as a focus for the pathogen to come back into the stand and then move out and potentially reinfect more tan oak sprouts on the site. Also, the results are very weather dependent. So if your management activity is followed by a dry spell of weather, that can be great. If it's followed by really wet conditions, especially over a long period of time, then that might make it more difficult for your management effectiveness to take hold. Overall, we recognize through experimenting with some of this management in Northern California and especially in Humboldt County, that recommendations, just like for any forest management activity, they need to be very site specific and they need to be tied to whatever your long-term goals are for your property, whether that is keeping habitat for plants or wildlife, whether it's keeping a specific aesthetic look, whether it's making money, or whatever your goals are. Another thing that has been tried and very effectively in coast live oak woodlands particularly, and this is different from the situation up in Humboldt County where we were trying it in tan oak, Douglas fir type forests, is removing bays only. In these true oak woodlands, such as the ones that you'll commonly see a little bit away from the coast in Mendocino County and Sonoma County, bay laurel removal alone can be very effective. So you'll see this spot, you can see on the left there's a small bay laurel, on the right there's an oak tree, and the bay laurel leaves are touching the crown of the oak tree. Just by removing those bay laurel trees that are close to oaks, you can achieve a pretty significant reduction in your risk that those oaks are going to be infected by Phytophthora ramorum. And at UC Berkeley and also at Phytosphere Research, they've developed some guidelines for distances from your tan oaks that you need to remove that bay laurel material in order for your treatment to be infected. What this graph shows is that the farther that you remove bay laurels away from your oaks that are at risk, the smaller your probability that they're going to be infected by the pathogen. But that also is affected by the size of the tree. So the bigger your tree is, basically the more of a target it is, and the farther you need to remove those bay laurels away from the oaks in order to reduce the chance that they're going to be infected by Phytophthora ramorum. And so this is just kind of a chart to show you the trees that you want to save, depending on the size of them, how far away you need to remove your bay laurels away. And this chart is found at the UC Berkeley Forest Pathology and Mycology website, which I have listed at the end of this talk for your reference. Another option that I mentioned, and this is one that really is oriented toward preventing trees from being infected in the first place, rather than trying to slow the spread of the pathogen on a wide scale, it's a chemical treatment, and the chemical is called phosphonate. Phosphonate is a fertilizer slash fungicide. It sort of has both sorts of qualities. It's basically a form of phosphorus, which is a nutrient that is important to plants, but that tends to be somewhat scarce in the environment. By applying this phosphonate fungicide, and one of the trade names of it is Agrifos, but there are others. I believe one of them is called Reliant, for example. By applying this to trees in various ways, you may be able to boost the defense response of the tree, and also you may be able to get the chemical into the tree's system so that when it does, if the pathogen does try to invade, the chemical will actually kill the pathogen. So it might have a little bit of a kills on contact of effect, as well as a general defense response boosting effect. And there are a couple of different ways you can apply it. On the left, on small trees and trees with thin bark, and trees that don't have a lot of moss on the bark to interfere with the absorption, you can actually spray the phosphonate fungicide on the trunk and have it absorbed into the tree. For larger trees or those that have thicker bark, as on the right, you can actually inject it into the tree. And these are things that landowners can do, but it's typically better, easier, and more cost-effective, and just more effective in general, to hire someone who's licensed or certified, such as an arborist, to deliver these kinds of treatments. They can be very effective. If you go to the UC Berkeley website that's at the end of this talk, you can find more detail. Also, the UC Cooperative Extension website at Humboldt and Del Norte counties can show you more detail about this as well through a publication that we put out a few years ago. So in general, in California, we have a variety of strategies that we can use to try to either prevent infection, slow the spread on a wider scale, or deal with the aftermath of the pathogen and try to cope with some of the devastating effects that it could have on your tan oaks and true oaks. But this chart simply reinforces the point that the approach you choose needs to be tied to your goal for your property. Whether it's already there and you want to continue to try to minimize those impacts from dead trees and falling trees, or whether you want to try to strategically protect a group of trees that are important to you. Maybe you have a grove of really large live oaks in your front yard that you don't want to get infected and die, just as an example. Or in that far right-hand column, maybe your goal is more to slow the spread on a wider scale and protect more of a landscape from the pathogen. So depending on what your goals are, here are a few of the things that have been tried or thought of but not yet tried for managing the pathogen. And we're all still in a very active mode of trying to experiment with these things, trying to learn from what other people are trying. If you have tried anything on your property that works or doesn't work, we would all love to know about it. So get in contact with us and share your experiences. Overall, for your forest stands, here are some of the considerations that you probably want to think about. What resources are most at risk? What are least at risk? Are you inside or outside of those infested areas that I showed on the maps in the last talk? So is sudden oak death in your area? Is it nearby? Is it far away from you? Are you in a sort of wet habitat where sudden oak death could easily invade? Are you in a drier area? You want to work strategically and try not to move the pathogen around further with whatever work you do out there in the forest. So knowing that this pathogen can persist in water, in soil, on tools and vehicles, in mud, try not to move it around. Try to work in uninfested areas before you move into infested areas so that you can clean everything at the end of the day and then start over the next day. And remembering again that your management options will depend on your goals and your site conditions. All of these things in this list are things you want to think about. Which hosts are there that are going to produce spores that go to other trees? What is your overall species composition and how do you want it to be in the future? How can you possibly dry your location out, reduce humidity, and keep that pathogen uncomfortable on the site, if you will? Is there a way to protect your high-value trees using agrifos or some other phosphonate product? Will removing strategic bay laurels, not necessarily all of them on your property, but some of them, will that help protect high-value oak trees or tan oak trees that are still there? And how can you integrate sudden oak death management into other activities or other goals that you have for the property? Whether it's making the property more resilient to drought, or reintroducing prescribed fire to the property, or improving the aesthetics of the property, or improving the wildlife habitat value of the property. Any or all of those things can go along with sudden oak death management. Thinking about management in a wider context, it's mostly been a disease of the unmanaged landscape. So we do think that managing your vegetation can have a positive effect on resilience to the pathogen, as well as helping you cope with the impacts of it. Coordinated action on a large scale where it has been tried, such as in Oregon, can slow the spread, but it may be difficult in other areas where the pathogen is established to do such large-scale management. That's why it's really important and valuable to us to hear your experiences on your properties. We would like to know on a smaller scale what works for you and what doesn't. We also want to think about other pathogens too, not just Phytophthora ramorum. So learning more about other non-native pathogen and insect issues on your property is helpful and important, and integrating those with managing sudden oak death. And then it's really important, no matter what management activity you do, to keep monitoring what the effects of your activities have been. Here is the last slide. I wanted to give you a few resources that you can go to, and these are all online resources. But of course, if you contact your local University of California Cooperative Extension Forest Advisor or your local CAL FIRE forest health specialist, such as me, or any of the academics at UC Berkeley or UC Davis who work with this pathogen, we can all give you more advice and more resources and more thoughts and discuss these things with you. Hopefully this is helpful as you're thinking about how to manage sudden oak death on your property and in your area of California. So good luck, and we look forward to hearing all your questions. Thanks.